In the first episode of my new series on the forced turning and surviving the crisis, I introduced the novel and discussed the cyclum and the idea of cyclical history. We talked about the importance of knowing history and being able to predict when society is next due to experience a shift, whether it be a high, an awakening, unraveling, or a crisis, or in other words, the summer, spring, autumn, or winter. In today's episode, we examine the quaternities that form the human life, the four generational archetypes. Generational theories have become quite prominent in the pop culture of recent years, especially the term millennial or Gen Z becoming the brunt of many comedic jokes. For example, it may be hard to take the generational theory seriously when we have become so used to Gen Z unaliving sparkle themselves, or millennials being obsessed with skinny jeans, or obsessed and addicted to their phones. But in fact, the social generation theories date all the way back to the fin de siècle movement preceding the French Revolution. The generations are critical because they shape the season almost as much as the season shapes them. The seasons they are born in leave a different emotional imprint on them, and the difference in these emotional imprints are the drivers of social interaction. Children mirror each other's dread, youth each other's valor, midlifers each other's competence, and seniors each other's wisdom. In each generation there is a great event, not necessarily something as giant as World War II. It could be something like the Cultural Wars or a stock market crash. And after the great event is resolved, our memories grant each generation a unique location in history, a unique persona. For example, the young may be marked as heroes. Those very same young will grow up to be midlifers who want the public to recognize them, who want the public to praise them, far more prideful than their previous generation, while the next generation may become very timid and concerned with the hubris of their counterparts. Last episode, we talked briefly about the cycles of war, and we can examine here how these cycles influence the people within them. Every 40 years or so, the persona of each phase of life becomes nearly the opposite of that established by the generation that has once passed through it. These differences largely go unnoticed, because the differences seldomly are important for more than 2 or 3 phases of life, and by the time the next generation comes, they eventually die out and they don't see how it has been repeating throughout history. The term generational gap has been used so long to talk from anything ranging from the serious to how teenage rebels oppose their parents. Also, we as humans have a hard time accepting these theories, which is why they tend to die out, because we want to be unique, we want to be special, and instead generations and the theories stand as reminders of how much people remain tied to the subconscious vestiges of their past. I mean, it's not a very pleasing thought to think that we haven't improved at all, and that all my mistakes, as comforting as it may seem that I'm not here alone, have been repeated hundreds and hundreds of times by my ancestors, and humanity just never seems to learn. Before we go deeper into the merits of the theory outlined in the forced turning, I think it's important to slow down and to reflect on what a generation is and what their social lengths are. So the length of a generation in birth years is approximately the length of the phase of life in years of age, and you can identify a generation by looking at 3 things: common location in history, common beliefs and behavior, and common perceived membership in the group. Common location refers to where the members were in terms of their phases of life when a great event occurs. For example, right after World War II, the GIs were in young adulthood, the lost in midlife, the silent in their youth. Common locations is where they are in terms of the same concrete historical problem. Common beliefs show its members to be different from people born at another time. They are the means by which a generation moves history. For example, the lost were skeptics of progress and Republican leaning, while the GIs were optimists about government and Democrat leaning. The GIs tried to widen the gap between acceptable gender norms, while the boomers tried to narrow it. Common perceived membership is about how the group sees itself, how it defines itself. It gives the generation a sense of destiny and a sense of identity. So, this is a channel about literature, so let's link back to it. The famous circle of lost generation authors includes T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound, but it doesn't include writers just a little bit younger like John Steinbeck or W.H. Auden. If you're not sure of what a generation is or what generation someone belongs to, you can always just ask. Generation X is originally a label that was put forward by people who didn't want to be considered a part of the boomers. And likewise, each generation decides where they're going as a generation, and each one has leaders that set the tone, followers that legitimize the tone, and dissenters who either distance themselves, those people you see on social media who say, I was born in the wrong generation, or people who more rarely, protest about the norms set out by their generation. A generation can collectively choose its destiny, but you cannot personally choose your generation any more than you can choose your parents or your native land. That much is fate, conditioning everything about your life, whether or not you like it or care to notice it. As Martin Heidegger observed, the fateful act of living in and with one's generation completes the drama of human existence. We talked a lot about the importance of number 4 last episode, and it appears here too. The quaternities build a theory of human personality and physiognomy. For example, Hippocrates proposed 4 bodily liquids, or humors as he called them: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. So he believed they produced different temperaments. Sanguineous blood was like the moisture of spring. Cholericus, yellow bile, was like the hot temper of summer. Melancholicus, black bile, like the name suggests, melancholy, like autumn. And of course, phlegmaticus, phlegm, the cold grimness of winter. A sanguine person could be like spring, optimistic and pleasant. A choleric, on the other hand, would have the fury passion of summer, whereas a melancholic would have the sadness of autumn, and a phlegmatic the slowness and severity of winter. Likewise, a sanguineous would be against the melancholicus, much like spring opposes autumn, and the battle of summer and winter would be embodied within the cholericus and the phlegmaticus. And each temperament was actually further associated with gods like Prometheus, Dionysus, Apollo, and Epimetheus. This may seem a little outdated, but modern thinkers wrote similar ideas. So far on this channel, we have encountered Jung through Murakami and his work, but let's go back to Jung's original ideas. Jung wrote about the attitude type based on psychological functions: thinking versus feeling, reason and intuition and sensation. Think of the popular MBTI content. He creates his theory based on the ancient quaternities, and his archetypes draw energy from their dynamic opposites: thinking versus feeling, sensing versus intuiting. And going back to the generations, according to the Hellenics, each generation has an associated season and a historical order. It's the point in which they enter midlife. Midlife has been viewed as important, not as a time of crisis, as we say midlife crisis in modern day times, but rather it's a time in which a generation has the maximum power over society. For example, the hero enters midlife in the secular spring, the artist in the summer during the awakening, the prophet in the autumn, and the nomad in the winter, a crisis. Our ideas of generations are shaped by the media and the myths they create, and these archetypes help us understand who the people are, and it helps generations understand themselves and define themselves. Everyone knows millennials like the term chuggy or wear skinny jeans because that's the myth that's put forward about millennials. And let's look at some examples of traditional myths about the different generations. Hero myths are split into 2 categories, either a physical deed or a spiritual deed. A physical deed is where a hero saves a life or wins a battle. A spiritual deed is where they learn to experience human life and come back with a special message for humanity. Sometimes the spiritual and the secular hero even appear in the same story, like when a young man goes to fight a dragon and he's aided by an old man who gives him a mysterious amulet and magic spell. Sometimes the elder prophet is an enemy, like Medea was for Theseus, or like the witches were in Snow White and the Wizard of Oz, but most often the elder people seem to aid the hero. Think of Merlin's teacher or Shifu in Kung Fu Panda. The purpose of these myths is basically to get people through the crisis, because the young hero needs to gain some experience from stories about their predecessors, and the young hero needs to prepare because they're the ones to save the world. Another myth is for the prophet. So when the prophet is young and the king is old, these stories follow a different path from those meant for the heroes. These stories tell of a world where dynasties are not made, but rather people are suffocating under them. In these stories, they talk about the insight and the bravery of the youth, and it's juxtaposed to the weakness and the lack of values of the old. Young prophets like Moses or Jesus are contrasted to people who lack values, like Pontius Pilate, because they're blind and they're not wise. Here, the elders don't have the wisdom that we associate them with in traditional tales. In Islamic culture, young Muhammad challenges the immorality of the rich merchant families. In Western stories, think of Merlin standing up to the king or Bacchus cursing King Midas. And the tone of these myths builds stress and hostility between the generations. These stories widen the generational gap, because how can a generation that grows up on stories of being told that you're the best and you're so much smarter than your elder not grow up to hate the very elder they have been taught to see as foolish? This contributes to the awakening era, where people begin to question the values of the high and things begin to be just a little less smooth flowing. Myths about nomads and artists are far less grand because these archetypes have their turning points growing up rather than already being at midlife. Nomads grow up in an awakening, and artists grow up in a crisis. These archetypes encounter their second turning point entering midlife. The nomad enters midlife in a crisis, the artist in an awakening, polar opposites. These myths speak more about relationships and building human connections rather than the rising and falling of dynasties. Nomads grow up as alienated children, whereas artists grow up as sheltered and overprotective ones. Nomads are raised to manage alone and know that nothing is expected of them, which is a very hard burden to bear, knowing that no matter what you do, nobody seems to care. Whereas artists are raised to work with others, burdened with incredibly high expectations, knowing that no matter what you do, you will never be able to please the people who came before you. The myths of these two generational archetypes reflect that. So whereas heroes have very real and concrete problems, concrete dragons that they fight, for nomads and artists, for these poor two generations, their problems seem to be of the big, all-encompassing side. Like Hansel and Gretel, who have to fight to defeat cannibalism, right? A wider problem. Or Aladdin, who tries to make sure that people don't kill him for the lamp. Or, for example, Pinocchio, who tries to escape slavery. Parents are often lacking entirely in these narratives. The nomads are often overlooked, and they're the generation that does the dirty work without expecting praise or reward, whereas the artists do their best to do a small part to help because they're taught not to question orders and to just do the things that they've been told to do. Artists are so protected that sometimes the outer world seems invisible. Think of Winnie the Pooh, and then apply a nomad view and look deeper within the story and see the crumbling world outside. Jung observed that each archetype is best revealed by the one across the cycle, not the one preceding it. The two sanguine, aging heroes are countered by the fresh insights of young prophets, the two melancholic aging prophets by the valor of young heroes, the two phlegmatic aging nomads by the sensitivity of young artists, and the two choleric aging artists by the survival skills of young nomads. That's why a grandchild may feel closest to their grandparent. Archetypes don't create archetypes, they create the shadow of an archetype. During a crisis, nomad-led families overprotect artist children. During an awakening, artist-led families underprotect nomad children. Following a crisis, hero-led families expand the freedoms of prophet children. Following an awakening, prophet-led families curtail the freedoms of hero children. In short, a prophet generation grows up as increasingly indulgent post-crisis children, comes of age as the narcissistic young crusaders of an awakening, cultivates principles as moralistic midlifers, and emerges as wise elders guiding the next crisis. A nomad generation grows up as underprotected children during an awakening. It comes of age as the alienated young adults of a post-awakening world, mellows into pragmatic midlife leaders during a crisis, and ages into tough post-crisis elders. A hero generation grows up as increasingly protected post-awakening children, comes of age as the heroic young team workers of a crisis, demonstrates hubris as energetic midlifers, and emerges as powerful elders attacked by the next awakening. An artist generation grows up as overprotected children during a crisis, comes of age as the sensitive young adults of a post-crisis world, breaks free as indecisive midlife leaders during an awakening, and ages into empathetic post-awakening elders. The most famous heroes are typically associated with conquest, rationalism, invention. Rulers like Lorenzo the Magnificent or Ivan the Great, artists like Botticelli or Da Vinci, explorers like Columbus, Prophets, around 40 years later, are remembered through names like Martin Luther or William Tyndale or Charles V of Spain. Names that ring with inner fervor and self-absorption and judgmentalism. And the hero celebrates the splendor of man's power over nature, whereas the prophet glorifies the inner power of God over man, and they hate the hubris of their shadow. The heroic Arthurian generation laid the political foundation for Europe to break out of its Middle Ages, while the prophetic Reformation generation of Henry VIII, who basically said, I don't want anything else to do with the church, I want a divorce, lays the religious foundation, and together the prophet and the hero build a new world. But it's not only about the religion, it's about racism and ethnicity. America's loudest challenges against racism came with prophets coming of age, and the rise of new ethnicities came with the coming of nomad into midlife. However, racist reactions have reflected a parental urge to protect childhoods of future hero archetypes. America offers a great example of generational cycles because of how it has drawn so many different people of different genders, different cultures, different immigrants, who all believe in the American dream, who all believe in this idea of meritocracy, that no matter who you are, you have a chance. There have been 24 generations in the Anglo-American lineage, with the first 6 being purely English, the next 4 colonial, and the 11th being the first American. So today's millennials are the 24th in full lineage and 14th in the American line. The prophets are known for their coming of age passion and their principled leadership, like FDR with the fireside chats. Their principles are vision, values, religion. Some of their leaders include Benjamin Franklin, Abraham Lincoln, Roosevelt. They're moralists, they summon human sacrifice, they wage religious wars, and early none of them see wars, they merely wage them, so later they come to be admired for their inspiring words rather than their loud deeds. The nomads are most known for their rising adult life years of trouble-causing and midlife years of getting-it-done leadership, like Stonewall Jackson or George Patton. Underprotected as children, contrary to the increasingly indulged prophets, they become overprotective parents. Their principal endowments are liberty, survival, and honor. Think of Ulysses Grant, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower. They include people who have hanged witches and people who led troops into battle. They do the things that get done and they follow through with their words. The heroes are remembered for their collective coming-of-age succession, like D-Days, or for their elder achievements like the Louisiana Purchase or the Apollo moon launches. Increasingly protected as children, they become increasingly indulgent as parents. They value community, affluence, technology. You can see them in Jefferson, Madison, Reagan. They all become advocates for economic prosperity and optimism in midlife. Meanwhile, artists are known for their quiet years of rising adulthood and then their midlife years of consensus-based leadership, the compromises of the Whig era or the budget and peace processes. Overprotected as children, they become underprotective parents. They value pluralism, expertise, due process, think Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson. Sensitive and complex social technicians, they advocate for fair play and inclusions, and they end up one of the most expert politician types. Because of their differences, the archetypes produce sharply different social results. Think of how a society led by old heroes and uncertain midlife artists would differ to a society run by judgmental old prophets and pragmatic midlife nomads. The latter is where we are right now, and the former is where we'll be in a couple years when my generation comes of age. The 4 turnings are a detailed topic for episode 3, where I want to focus on them in more depth, but here's a brief outline in order to help us understand the generations better. The first turning is a high. Old prophets disappear, nomads enter elderhood, heroes enter midlife, artists enter young adulthood, and a new generation of prophets is born. The second turning is an awakening. Old nomads disappear, heroes enter elderhood, artists enter midlife, prophets enter young adulthood, and a new generation of child nomads is born. The third turning is an unraveling. Old heroes disappear, artists enter elderhood, prophets enter midlife, nomads enter young adulthood, and a new generation of child heroes is born. The fourth turning is a crisis. Old artists disappear, prophets enter elderhood, nomads enter midlife, heroes enter young adulthood, and a new generation of child artists is born. Now that I have outlined the main features of each generation, I can confidently send you into my next installment coming next week, where we will look at the four turnings in more detail and examine each generation in the context of each turning. I'm sorry to keep breaking up the episodes like this, but each episode is so heavy in terms of its detail, much like each chapter was filled with detail in the book. So it's a very big necessity so that next time we can look at the four turnings clearer with the four generations in mind. We will look at specifically the first three turnings of America and discuss the example of the GI, look closely at their generation, how coming into midlife as heroes during a high shaped them, and how they shaped the high. We will look at the second turning and how the awakening during the consciousness revolution was shaped by the artists coming to midlife. And finally, the third turning, the culture wars that were shaped by coming into midlife prophet. We will also briefly look at the fourth turning, but not in too much depth because that will come after the new book has been released. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next episode.